Hello, comrades, and welcome to another video on the Russian Revolution Area of Study 1. This video will outline World War I as a cause of the February, I always struggle to say the word February Revolution. So here's a great quote from Friedrich Engels, who is the co-author of the Communist Manifesto written by Marx and Engels. He said, "War is the midwife of every old society pregnant with a new one." So at times of war, there is great hardship for the ordinary people, and therefore there is a greater likelihood of revolution. We saw that with the Russo-Japanese War in 1904-1905. That was one of the many causes of the 1905 revolution, and we're going to see that again now with Russia's involvement in World War I. So let's start by talking about the causes of Russia's involvement in the war. So on the 28th of June, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand is assassinated by a member of a Serbian terrorist group. This was the triggering event of World War I and really launched the war. The Austrian government sought German support for a declaration of war on Serbia, while Serbia appealed to Russia for support. On the 17th of July, 1914, Tsar Nicholas ordered the full mobilization of his troops against Austria, which put enormous pressure on Germany. On the 19th of July, Germany declared war on the Russian Empire, and by the 22nd of July, the Great War had begun, with Austria being fully mobilized, Germany declaring war on France and invading Belgium, and Britain declaring war on Germany. So that's just the causes of the war, and the reason that Russia was involved was due to their alliance with Serbia. So if you remember from the Russo-Japanese War, one of Nicholas's advisors or ministers, the interior minister, had talked about how we need a short, decisive victory to stem the tide of revolution. So the reason that he said that back in 1904 was because when a country goes to war, there is a rise in nationalism and patriotism, generally speaking. This was definitely seen with World War I. So the declaration of war led to an initial rise in Russian patriotism. This is shown through a number of factors. The government changed the name of St. Petersburg, which was quite German sounding, to Petrograd, more Russian sounding. The Duma dissolved itself until the end of the war. Remember, this is the fourth Duma, which was very conservative and very much aligned with the Tsar, with many Octobrists and Kadets, etc. So the Duma chose to dissolve itself until the end of the war so that they would not interfere in the war effort. And also strikes and protests dramatically declined, and revolutionaries who questioned the war, such as Lenin, were seen as traitors, and Lenin was in fact seen as a German spy. So that's the initial responses to the war. In terms of Russia's readiness for war, they weren't ready at all. Russia mobilized 6.5 million men, so an enormous army. In terms of manpower, they were very much organized and ready. But they only had 4.6 million rifles available. That's only 2/3 of their armed forces with guns. Soldiers without a gun were told to pick one up from the wounded or dead. Soldiers were also only given canvas boots, which were fine in summer conditions, but weren't suitable for winter conditions or trench warfare, which, as you know, really characterizes World War I. So the war began in the summer, but by a few months in, they didn't have the appropriate apparel to fight in winter conditions. Russian generals were also appointed based on loyalty to the Tsar rather than their competence. They were ignorant of modern military tactics and lacked tactical initiative. So the soldiers were largely unarmed. or were underarmed. The soldiers didn't have appropriate apparel in the fact that they only had canvas boots, and the generals were incompetent. Here is a list of 4 military campaigns. You can see them on this map. So the Battle of Lemberg, the 5th to the 21st of August, 1914. This was a victory for Russia. All of the greens are victories and reds or light greens victories, light reds defeats. So Russia defeated the Austrian forces and captured the Galician capital of Lemberg. We can see that here. The second military campaign was the Battle of Tannenberg. This took place from the 13th to the 17th of August, 1914, so at the same time as Lemberg. It was a poorly planned offensive by a Russian army that outnumbered the Germans, but the Germans were better armed and better directed. So 70,000 Russian soldiers were killed or wounded versus Germany's 15,000, and 100,000 soldiers were captured. That took place up here near Warsaw in Poland. The Battle of Masurian Lakes was the third military campaign. These all happened, as you can see, these first 3 all happened within a month. And this took place up here in the north. Russia lost 60,000 men against the German offensive and were forced to retreat from German territory. So already in just 1 month, the Russian army was on the back foot. 2 years later, in 1916, was the Brusilov offensive. That's down here in the south. That took place from the 22nd of May to the 31st of July, 1916. General Alexei Brusilov, who we'll see him again later, was one of the few genuinely talented Russian military commanders that wasn't just appointed due to loyalty to the Tsar. And he led a campaign in 1916 that caused the collapse of the Austrian-Hungarian front. That's why that is in green, because that sounds like a success. However, 550,000 Russian soldiers were killed or wounded, and reinforcements were slow to arrive, which brought the Russian advance to a halt. So it started well, but it petered out. So you can see here, the front line in 1914 moved all the way to the edge of Poland and right to the border of Germany. In 1915 to 1917, they'd been pushed back beyond Brest-Litovsk into Ukraine. And by 1918, so by the time that the Bolsheviks were in power and they were seeking to end the war, and before the end of World War I, it had been pushed way back into Russian territory. So it's a slow retreat for the Russians. Let's have a look at the effects of the war. Now, there are multiple effects. There are human costs and social effects and economic effects. So there's a lot of information that I've just tried to take the key points from. But if you look in your textbook, you'll find much more detail. So Russia lost more soldiers in World War I than any other country. By mid-1915, 4 million soldiers were dead. So in terms of a human cost of the war, it was pretty devastating. A quarter of Russian soldiers were sent to the front unarmed, and Russia lost so much territory that 23 million Russians lived under German occupation. In terms of the economic impact of the war, Russian industry was solely focused on production for the war effort at the expense of Russia's civilian population. Russia's poor... Continuing with the economic impact, inflation increased exponentially, which had the greatest impact on Russia's working classes, since the average real worth of wages fell 65% below 1913 levels. We're experiencing inflation right now in Australia, where even though people's wages might be slowly increasing, they're not increasing at the rate of the price of goods. So that's what we mean by real worth of wages. So even in Russia during World War I, wages did increase, they almost doubled, the price of goods quadrupled. So the real worth of wages actually fell. Russia's poor railway infrastructure was also unable to cope, and the demand for peasants to serve in the army reduced agricultural output. By 1916, due to this lack of agricultural output, the calorie intake of workers had fallen by a quarter, and infant mortality, or children under the age of 5 who died, had doubled. So workers and their families were very hungry as a result of the reduction in agricultural output, the emphasis on the war, and the subsequent reduction in calorie intake. Meanwhile, Russia's business elites were able to vastly increase their wealth. So while the poor get poorer and hungrier, the rich get richer. War and politics. So Tsar Nicholas refused to cooperate with non-governmental organizations such as the Union of Zemstvos and the Union of Towns. Now, these were liberal organizations who sought to assist with the war effort. However, the Tsar refused to cooperate. Similarly, support from the War Industries Committee, an organization of patriotic middle-class businessmen who tried to assist again with the war effort, was rejected by the Tsar and his ministers. So he was, as Pavel Miliukov said, brushing aside the hand that was offered to him. The Tsar recalled the Duma on the 19th of July, 1915, but the war led many Duma deputies to become increasingly critical of the government. So remember that the Duma had dissolved itself at the start of the war as they didn't want to get in the way. The Tsar recalled the Duma in July 1915, and on the 3rd of September 1915, the Duma was dissolved again. Now, one of the reasons that the Duma was dissolved was that by August 1915, a number of cadet and Octobrist deputies formed a political alliance called the Progressive Bloc. Now, this is something that can be mentioned if you were asked in an exam about liberal ideas and reforms leading to the February Revolution. Remember that the cadets were a progressive liberal party and the Octobrists were a conservative liberal party. So they formed the Progressive Bloc, whose intention was to avert revolution through further reforms. However, Nicholas rejected these proposals and sacked any ministers who supported the reformers. That led to the Duma being dissolved again. So as Pavel Miliukov, cadet and prominent member of the Progressive Bloc, said, they brushed aside the hand that was offered them. So the Liberals are trying to help through the Union of Zemstvos, the Union of Towns, the Progressive Bloc, but the Tsar is refusing their help. Miliukov gave a damning speech on the 14th of November, 1916. He said, when the Duma keeps everlastingly insisting that the rear must be organized for a successful struggle, the government persists in claiming that organizing the country means organizing a revolution, and deliberately prefers chaos and disorganization. What is it? Stupidity or treason? So this speech, the chutzpah for Miliukov to claim that the Tsarist regime was either stupid or treasonous, really showed how even liberal groups had turned away from the Tsar by late 1916. Miliukov's speech articulated the political crisis unfolding in Russia, part of it being that the Tsar had moved to the front, which I'll talk about in a second, and that the Tsarina and Rasputin, who I'll talk about in my next video, were left largely in charge. So yes, he articulated the political crisis, and even conservative supporters of the monarchy agreed with his sentiments. So on the 22nd of August 1915, while the Duma was still in session, remember that they had been recalled in July, and hang on, was it July or June? Yes, July, and disbanded in early September. So 22nd of August 1915, Tsar Nicholas dismissed Grand Duke Nikolai and appointed himself commander-in-chief of Russia's armed forces. All of the Tsar's advisors, except for the Tsarina, Alexandra, urged Nicholas not to go to the front and leave Petrograd. The Tsar had no experience in military command, so all major battlefield decisions were made by the Chief of Staff, General Alexeyev. But by making himself commander-in-chief, any military failures, of which there were many, were attributed to the Tsar. President of the Duma, Mikhail Rodzianko, who was an Octobrist, wrote to the Tsar in August 1915, saying the situation will be even worse if the army loses courage. In this event, defeat is inevitable, and within the country, revolution and anarchy will then inevitably break out. Your Majesty, before it is too late, revoke your decision, no matter how hard it may be for you. So he's pleading with the Tsar to not name himself commander-in-chief and to not go to the front. But the Tsar does not listen. He goes to the front to play at war. He leaves any military defeats or military blunders. He leaves himself responsible for those, and he leaves Petrograd at a time of great unrest. So that brings us to the end of this video. In the next video, we will talk about Tsarina Alexandra and Grigory Rasputin, who were largely left in charge after Nicholas named himself commander-in-chief. So I hope you found this video interesting and useful, and I will see you next time.